If you're a fan of Marvel Comics, you may know a character called the Watcher. Part of an immensely powerful race, the Watcher observes the events on Earth, all of its wars and upheavals, without ever interfering, a mute witness to history. But what if we told you that a real-life Watcher exists, one that has seen kings and emperors rise and fall, revolutions explode, and reigns of terror soak the streets with blood? The name of this Watcher? The Paris Hotel de Ville. Originally constructed as a 16th century hall, the Hotel de Ville has stood at the epicenter of the wildest events in history. It was on its doorstep that the French Revolution ignited, in its opulent rooms that Robespierre tried to commit suicide, and in its vast corridors that a radical anarchist sect seized Paris at the end of the Franco-Prussian War. The saying goes, if these walls could talk, what stories they would tell. Well, today we are going to listen as the Hotel de Ville spills its secrets from Napoleon III to revolution. In 1533, Francis I was a king with a problem. He was the ruler of one of the greatest powers in Europe, with a city, Paris, that was likely the largest in the whole of Christendom. But Francis was a guy who cared about appearances, and the cramped, smelly Paris of the 16th century did not look like the greatest city that Christianity had to offer. So Francis gathered his architects and ordered them to build the Hotel de Ville. Despite its name, the Grand Renaissance structure wouldn't actually be a hotel. There'd be no bellhop, no reception, no free ice. Rather, it'd be what most of us call a city hall, a place for the provost of merchants, the guy most of us would call mayor, to run Paris from. Sadly, the city hall would be so magnificent that Francis would never get to see it. The king died in 1547, a full 70 years before the Hotel de Ville was finished. It wasn't declared open until 1628, by which time the latest in a long line of guys called Louis was on the throne. It would be under one of his descendants that the Hotel de Ville would have its first brush with history. Now, at this point in the video, we're going to jump forward in time a little bit, all the way to 1789, when King Louis XVI is king, Marie Antoinette is queen, and France is rumbling with discontent. And by the way, we must apologize if you came to this video itching to hear about municipal planners using the hotel in the early 17th century, but we've only got about 20 minutes, and trust us, this is way more interesting. Anyway, the big deal in France in 1789 was something called the Estates General. A few years before, it had become obvious that the nation was broke. So broke that the entire state was teetering on the brink of collapse. Unfortunately, financial reform was impossible. With hard decisions to be made, it had become a rallying cry for the king to call representatives of all three estates, the clergy, the nobility, and the commoners. Thereby, these hard choices would have something resembling legitimacy. For a long time, Louis XVI had resisted that call. But by 1789, he'd finally accepted that calling the estates was the only way to save his kingdom from bankruptcy. Only there was a problem. No Estates General had met since 1614, before the Hotel de Ville was even finished. You couldn't simply ask a priest, a peasant, and a posho to all come over and hash things out. No. There would have to be elections. Specifically, deputies would have to be chosen to represent the commoners. In Paris, that meant dividing the city into 60 districts to elect delegates. It was meant to be a simple administrative exercise, nothing that would have any lasting consequence. No one could have known it in 1789, but that simple act of administration would become the spark that would set the world on fire. On the night of the 14th of July, 1789, Jacques de Flesselles was inside the Hotel de Ville when he heard the first shouts. It had been a hectic few months. The Estates General had finally met in May, only for the king to do everything in his power to ignore it. In retaliation, the commoners had split off and declared themselves the National Assembly, the new authority representing the people of France. Louis XVI had tried to physically lock them out of their meeting hall, but the Assembly, they just met on a tennis court where its members all swore an oath not to disband until France had a constitution. Today, the tennis court oath is seen as a pivotal event in the French Revolution, the moment when the king's authority evaporated. But no one at the time realized they were even having a revolution. It wasn't until an angry Parisian mob storms the Bastille on the 14th of July that it became clear that the old order was collapsing. And now here was poor Jacques de Flesselles listening in horror as that same angry mob converged on the Hotel de Ville. As the provost of merchants, basically the mayor, Flesselles took it upon himself to go out and speak to the crowd. But this being revolutionary Paris, that didn't go very well. And by not going very well, we mean that the mob totally shot him, chopped up his body, and paraded around on pikes. As the blood of Jacques de Flesselles dripped down the steps of the hotel, it was clear to everyone inside that nothing would ever be the same again. The very next day, representatives of the 60 districts of Paris met at the conquered Hotel de Ville. Their demands were simple. They wanted Paris to be run by Parisians. Like the National Assembly before them, they declared themselves sovereign, calling themselves the Paris Commune. For Louis XVI, the appearance of the Commune was deeply troubling. While no one was wheeling out the guillotine just yet, he needed to only look at the remains of poor Jacques to see what fate might await him if he opposed its creation. So the king, well, he did the only thing he could. He gave the Commune his blessing. On July the 17th, just 3 days after the storming of the Bastille, Louis XVI reluctantly presented himself at the Hotel de Ville. There, the Commune took him up to a balcony and sent him out to see the crowd. The sight of the king on the balcony of the Hotel de Ville, apparently all cool with the revolution, sent the Parisian mobs into raptures. Some even shouted, "Long live the king." The following spring, May 1790, the National Assembly passed a law allowing the Commune to run Paris however it saw fit. While that made sense in the early days of the revolution, when liberty, equality, and fraternity were still in supply, those early days were already almost over. When the Commune finally heard the siren song of the guillotine, everyone was going to regret giving them power. In a top 10 list of days that changed history, August 10th, 1792 could easily be number one. That was the day the liberal, only slightly murderous First French Revolution metamorphosed into the rampaging guillotine monster. The night before, the Hotel de Ville had been shattered by the Commune breaking into two parts, the original liberal Commune and the working-class insurrectionary Commune. As the sun dawned on that fateful day, the insurrectionary Commune announced itself the sole authority in Paris. As if on cue, the streets exploded. The bloodshed of August the 10th was beyond anything that Paris had yet seen. The working-class sans-culottes, the urban poor, all came out on the side of the insurrectionaries. By the time the smoke cleared, the new Commune was in control of Paris and everyone was in big trouble. It was this new 1792 Commune that brought guys like Georges Danton and Maximilien Robespierre into the limelight. Working out of the Hotel de Ville, they used their power over the Paris mob to change the course of the revolution. When the newly created National Convention threatened to get too moderate, they sent sans-culottes to attack centrist deputies. When revolutionary tribunals were created, they made sure that their men sat on them. And even when the radical Girondins got too moderate for the Commune, they helped Danton and Robespierre denounce and execute them. By September 1793, the alliance between the super-radicalized Commune in the Hotel de Ville and the extremists in the National Convention was strong enough for them to do anything. What they wanted was to bring terror to the streets of Paris. Over the next 10 months, the Reign of Terror, under the direction of Robespierre, sent 17,000 people to the guillotine. As the bodies piled up, the Commune and the Hotel de Ville simply cheered. By mid-1794, the violence had become so staggering that even the street fighters of Paris were appalled. Someone had to do something, and on July the 27th, they did. That day, the National Convention rose up against Robespierre, stripping him of his power, an event known today as the Thermidorian Reaction. Realizing his time as dictator was over, Robespierre fled to the hotel, hoping the sans-culottes would protect him. But they didn't. No one showed to save the bloodthirsty madman. As the convention soldiers rolled in, Robespierre raised a pistol to his head and fired. The suicide attempt succeeded in only blowing the bottom of his jaw off. In pain, bleeding heavily, Robespierre was arrested in one of the hotel's opulent rooms. The following day, the Reign of Terror's architect was dragged to the guillotine. Just before he was beheaded, the executioner ripped off the dangling piece of his jaw. The screams could be heard all the way back to the hotel. In the wake of Robespierre's fall, the Hotel de Ville faded from the story of the French Revolution. The Commune's authority was stripped when the Directory seized power after Thermidor. In May 1795, the sans-culottes tried one last time to occupy the hotel. But though reactionary, the Directory was just as vicious as Robespierre. The army crushed the sans-culottes, and the dream of the Paris Commune died along with them. At least, it did for a while. Because while the story of the French Revolution may be over, the story of the Hotel de Ville is not. In just a few short decades, the Watcher of Paris would be back at the forefront of history. The next 2 decades passed like a hurricane. Napoleon overthrew the Directory, did some conquering, made the mistake of invading Russia, and then got overthrown himself. By 1814, the Napoleonic era was over, for now at least, and Louis XVI's brother, Louis XVIII, was now on the throne. Because nobody liked the idea of all those decades of revolution being for nothing, Louis was only allowed to take the throne after agreeing to something called the Charter of 1814. Basically a constitution, the charter guaranteed some freedoms while acknowledging the king's power derived from the masses and not from God pointing his giant sky finger at Louis and declaring, "I choose you." For the next few years, the charter held France together. It survived Napoleon's return in 1815, his subsequent downfall, and the restoration of Louis XVIII. It even survived Louis's 1824 death and the transfer of power to his brother Charles X. But it wouldn't survive the new king's reign. That's because Charles was an old-fashioned "God chose me to be king, so suck it, peasant" type of ruler. By 1830, he was so offended by the charter's limits on his power that he decided to get rid of it altogether. Monday, the 26th of July, 1830, became known as the day that Charles X published the 4 ordinances, effectively tearing up the charter. It also became known as the day Paris once again exploded. That day, people awoke to notices announcing Charles had banned the opposition, ended freedom of the press, and done a whole lot of other things considered to be not very cool. Out in his estate, the king's ambitious liberal cousin Louis Philippe, the Duc d'Orléans, even declared Charles had pulled off a royal coup. But if Charles thought he'd just made himself divine king of all of France, Paris had rather different ideas. On the night of Monday the 26th of July to Tuesday the 27th, there were demonstrations across Paris. Skirmishes. Come the morning, the army hastily moved to garrison the Hotel de Ville, lest any Parisians tried to pull another 1789. But sending the army in didn't have the calming influence that Charles had hoped for. Instead, it goaded the Parisians to start fighting. The violence that broke out that morning fired the starting gun on something known as the 3 Glorious Days. A citywide uprising. It saw ordinary Parisians fill the streets with improvised barricades and open fire on anyone who tried to dismantle them. By Wednesday, there was blood in the gutters and the whiff of gunpowder on the air. By Thursday, there was revolution. That day, the fighting was fiercest around the Hotel de Ville. The Parisian mobs went on the attack, determined to take the symbolic building. Fearing a massacre, the army commander gave the order to pull back. As his forces fled the city, the last thing they saw was the blood-stained flag of Charles X pulled down and the tricolor hoisted high above the Hotel de Ville. After 3 days of fighting, the revolutionaries had won. But what did this actually mean? As Charles X fled into exile, his head still remarkably attached to his body, everyone started looking nervously around to see if any guillotines showed up. Was this a revival of the 1789 revolution, the 1792 insurrection, or was this something new? It was while Paris was in this state of confusion that Louis Philippe struck. Remember that we introduced Charles's ambitious liberal cousin very briefly? Well, he saw an opportunity in this chaos. Egged on by elements of the bourgeoisie, he rode into the burning city to present himself as a newer and kinder king. This was a move of unparalleled stupidity. Really, it's a wonder that no workers grabbed him, chopped off his head, and used it as a doorstep. But they didn't. Louis Philippe reached the Hotel de Ville just in time to meet the Marquis de Lafayette. A hero of the 1789 revolution, the Marquis was respected by all but the most radical of Parisians. Yet he was also aware that this new revolution could snowball into a reign of terror if it wasn't wrapped up, like right now. So he took Louis Philippe into the hotel and got him to promise to be a more liberal king. Then the Marquis draped them both in a tricolor, marched out onto the balcony, and publicly embraced the new king. The crowd below them erupted. It was just like Louis XVI stepping out onto the balcony in 1789 with hardened Parisian street fighters suddenly chanting, "Long live the monarchy." But just like with Louis XVI, the euphoria, it wasn't going to last forever. If the walls of the Hotel de Ville could talk, they might have warned King Louis Philippe that there was only one way these revolutions ever ended. In the end, it was banquets that brought the new king down. The so-called July monarchy of Louis Philippe ruled with a liberal touch that seemed velvet soft in comparison with Charles X, but painfully hesitant compared with everyone's hopes. The new government expanded the franchise, but also made sure that voting was something only the 1% could do. It guaranteed freedom of the press, but it also banned political gatherings. By 1847, the July monarchy was unpopular, out of touch, and ignorant of the public feeling. You can almost picture the Hotel de Ville putting its head in its hands and muttering, "Oh, Louis Philippe, I've seen all this before." And, well, the hotel was about to see it all over again. Throughout 1847, opposition groups got around the political meeting ban by holding banquets where people aired their grievances. But the banquets, they got so popular that Louis Philippe's government panicked and cancelled a massive one that was due to be held in Paris in February of 1848. And that was how Paris, on February the 22nd, came to be full of tens of thousands of super-politicized, super-hungry people who were super pissed at the thought of losing both their rights and their lunch. So, did they riot? Well, this is France we're talking about. Of course they rioted. They rioted until so many people were in the streets that it became another revolution. This time, though, the Hotel de Ville only played a peripheral role. From the point of view of Paris's watcher, it spent 2 days being ignored by crazed street fighters, only for people to remember it when news broke that Louis Philippe had abdicated and fled for England. On that day, February the 24th, 1848, a large group of radicals converged on the hotel, intending to declare a new Paris Commune. In the years since Thermidor, the Commune had become mythologized. Stripped of its context, it was remembered by the public less as a murderous enterprise and more as the one time in history that Paris had actually been run by Parisians. But when those radicals got to the hotel, they found members of the government opposition already there to declare a liberal republic. The two sides, they nearly came to blows, but eventually they reached a compromise. A new republic would replace a new commune, but it would follow a semi-radical agenda. The Second French Republic was announced from the Hotel de Ville soon after, but all the people making triumphant speeches, they forgot to mention just how short-lived it would be. The Liberals first tried to shortchange the Radicals, then cracked down on them. That summer, the June days saw 1,500 working-class Parisians killed. But the Liberals were wrong to think it was the myth of the Commune that threatened their new state. Like an audience watching a magic trick, they were too distracted by the threat of another 1792 to notice what was really happening. And what was really happening was that a brash populist was skillfully building an unlikely coalition to overthrow them all. In December 1848, Napoleon's nephew, Louis Napoleon, came to power on the back of France's first presidential election. Shortly after, on the anniversary of his uncle's coup, he launched a coup of his own. On December 2nd, 1852, Louis Napoleon officially abolished the Second French Republic and declared himself Emperor Napoleon III of the Second French Empire. One of the early acts of the new emperor was to give the area around the Hotel de Ville a facelift. Gone were the narrow, squalid streets, and in came open spaces and shiny boulevards. The hotel itself, the new emperor left intact, probably because its grand exterior complemented his own self-image. But Napoleon III failed to realize that the Parisians looking at the Hotel de Ville, they didn't see what he saw. They saw promises. The fabled promise of 1789 and the broken promises of 1830 and 1848. Twice now they'd been tricked into accepting a new king or emperor instead of reviving the dream of the Commune. As the saying almost always goes, fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, well, you're going to lose your head. For the Paris Commune to stand any chance of being reborn, though, things were going to have to go very, very wrong for Napoleon III. And, well, in 1870 they absolutely did. That summer, the emperor decided to teach the upstart nation of Prussia a lesson by personally leading a war against them. Instead, the well-trained Prussians, they quickly surrounded Louis Napoleon and the emperor was captured. Back in Paris, the by now standard stages of revolution played out. Once again, opposition deputies rushed to the Hotel de Ville and declared a new liberal republic. But this time, the street fighters of Paris were nowhere to be seen. Shortly after, the Prussian army surrounded the capital, trapping it in a brutal siege. And we mean brutal. The people of Paris were reduced to eating rats as Prussian bombs fell. All that time, the betrayals of 1830 and 1848 continued to eat away at people's souls. Even as the siege lasted into a miserable winter, little worms of resentment tunneled deep into Parisians' minds. While there was a war on, though, there was nothing they could do, not if they wanted to beat the Prussians. The problem was, though, not everyone did. In January 1871, the liberals in power, they agreed on an armistice with the Prussians, lifting the siege, but the terms were humiliating. In besieged Paris, the number one desire was to keep on fighting, to show those Prussian bastards what the French were made of. When instead Prussian soldiers held a victory parade past the Arc de Triomphe, the Parisians, they simply couldn't digest it. All that suffering, all those lunches of rat, it had all been for nothing. The elites of the new Third Republic did nothing to convince the masses otherwise. Rather than thank the Parisians for holding out for so long, President Adolphe Thiers demanded that they hand over all their guns lest they fall into radical hands. The Parisians' response to that was like, well, if you want our guns, you're gonna have to come and get them. To which the president replied, well, okay then, I will. On March the 18th, 1871, the French army marched into Paris. But the sight of the guns being removed and the government's clear lack of trust in the people, it was enough to send the city haywire. Fights broke out, there were skirmishes, barricades went up. By the time March 19th dawned, the National Guard had joined the Parisian street fighters. Overwhelmed, the French army surrendered the city. As they scuttled for the safety of the countryside, the commanders who looked back, they saw a flag triumphantly being hoisted above the Hotel de Ville. But it wasn't the tricolor of 1830. The red flag of socialism was now fluttering in the breeze. On March the 26th, the modern Saint-Calotte in Paris had descended on the Hotel de Ville. From its steps, the Paris Commune. It was declared reborn. 82 years after an angry mob had lynched poor Jacques de Flesselles and put themselves in charge of Paris, the Commune was back. And this time, it would lead to more bloodshed than ever. The story of the Paris Commune, it changes drastically depending on who you talk to. For some, the 1871 Commune was nothing less than a new reign of terror. No sooner were the communards in charge than they were taking clergymen and business people hostage. For others, such as Karl Marx, the new Commune was nothing less than history's first attempt at real, proper rule. The Commune's leaders were radical in every way. Some were professional revolutionaries, others were socialists, and still others were feminists. Not that they would have used these labels, though. In the mind of the Parisians running the new Commune, they were simply a continuation of the 1789 dream. They even based themselves in the Hotel de Ville. But while we can debate what the communards were for all eternity, there's one thing pretty much everyone is in agreement on, and that is that they were useless. Yeah, there are no stories here about reigns of terror and the swish and thunk of the guillotine. The communards were committed to a radical vision of Paris governing itself by consensus. That meant everyone having a say. That meant not becoming a Robespierre-style dictatorship. And I mean, guys, we love your integrity, but seriously? You're about to go toe-to-toe with the French army. Maybe at least designate someone as leader until, the crisis blows over. In the 2 short months that it ruled Paris, the Commune instituted sweeping reform, separating church from state, abolishing the death penalty, promoting workers' rights, and bringing in a social safety net. On the other hand, it was so militarily incompetent that it literally forgot to lock the back door. On May the 21st, the French army was scouting the city when they stumbled across a gate that was open and unguarded. So they went in, saw it wasn't a trap, and presumably said, "Sweet." By the time the communards noticed all these soldiers suddenly in their city, it was just too late. The Paris Commune fell in a long and bitter struggle known as the Bloody Week. Whereas the original Commune had aided the reign of terror, this time it was the French government that took the role of the angel of death. The army massacred the citizens of Paris. Men, women, children were all considered dangerous revolutionaries, and they were shot. At a minimum, it's thought that 7,000 Parisians were killed in that 1 week. At a maximum, 20,000 are said to have died, more than during the entire reign of terror. Not that the communards were blameless. As the net closed in, the revolutionaries executed their hostages. Then on May the 24th, the prominent communard Louis-Charles Delacluse made a momentous decision. He ordered the Hotel de Ville burned to the ground. The flames that engulfed the Watcher of Paris turned the skies above the city black. They triggered a wave of burnings as the communards tried to raise the capital. When the French army finally retook the city, there was almost no city left. That day, 240 years of Parisian history came to an end. Having stood witness to 4 French revolutions, the Reign of Terror, and enough bloodshed to fill several wars, the Hotel de Ville was finally gone. Its story, like that of the Paris Commune, was finally over. Or was it? In 1874, the French government decided to rebuild Paris. Having arrested, executed, or deported almost all of the city's radicals, they were no longer afraid of another commune arising, so they rebuilt the Hotel de Ville. They even rebuilt it in the same style as before. The story of the new Hotel de Ville is beyond the remit of our video today, but there is one tale from its life that we should mention. In 1944, as Allied troops converged on Paris and the Nazis were finally overthrown, Charles de Gaulle needed somewhere to announce the liberation of the capital. Somewhere that would have resonance not just with Parisians, but with all French people. He chose the Hotel de Ville. Even now, after so many centuries and revolutions and its own destruction, the story of the Watcher of Paris isn't over. For now, and maybe forever, it continues to sit there, as it always has, a silent witness to the hurricane of human history. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button below. Do not forget to subscribe. We got brand new videos currently twice a week, so hit that notification bell so you will find out when we put out a new video. Also, why not check out our sister channel, Biographics? I'm going to link to that below. And as always, thank you for watching.